The sun hung low in the sky over Lexington, Kentucky, casting a warm golden hue over the city streets. Officer Mark Anderson sat in his patrol car, adjusting his rearview mirror, scanning the traffic lazily. His partner, Emily Carter, sat beside him, tapping her pen on her notepad as she recorded observations from their earlier call. They had parked near Ashland Avenue, where the neighborhood shifted from modest homes to upscale condominiums. That's when Mark's gaze fixed on a sleek black car passing by. Inside, an African-American woman in a sharp navy blue suit sat poised, her hair neatly styled, her posture straight and confident. There was something about the way she carried herself that rubbed Mark the wrong way. "Look at that," he muttered, a sneer in his voice. "Fancy car. Bet she's up to something." Emily glanced up from her notes. "She's not speeding or breaking any laws," she replied, her voice careful. "What's the issue?" Ignoring her, Mark reached for the lights. "Let's find out," he said with a smirk, pulling onto the road behind her. The woman slowed and signaled before pulling over, her movements precise, almost rehearsed. Emily noticed her shoulders stiffen slightly as Mark parked and got out of the car. "Mark, this doesn't feel right," Emily murmured, hurrying after him. "You don't have probable cause." "Stay back, rookie," Mark snapped, his hand brushing against his holster. "I've been doing this for years. I know a suspect when I see one." As they approached the car, the window rolled down to reveal Grace Williams, her expression calm yet cautious, her dark eyes assessing the two officers with quiet resolve. "Good evening, officers," Grace greeted them evenly. "Is there a problem?" Mark leaned in, his shadow falling over the interior of the car. "License and registration," he barked, ignoring her question. Grace's hands moved slowly and deliberately, retrieving her documents and sliding them over to him. Emily noticed the slight tremor in Grace's fingers. Something felt off, but it wasn't Grace. Something about Mark's behavior seemed out of line. "What brings you to this part of town, Miss Williams?" Mark asked, his tone sharper now as he glanced at her documents. Grace tilted her head slightly and answered, "I'm on my way to a meeting." Mark smirked. "Must be some meeting, driving a car like that." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. The tension was palpable, and people on the sidewalk were starting to notice. She stepped closer to Mark, lowering her voice. "Mark, she's cooperating. Let's not escalate this." But Mark was already pulling on the door handle. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his grip tightening on the door. Grace hesitated but unbuckled her seatbelt, stepping out onto the pavement. Emily's heart raced as she watched Mark grab Grace's arm too roughly, pulling her away from the car. Grace stumbled slightly but regained her balance. "That's enough!" Emily shouted, stepping forward. Her voice quivered, but she stood her ground. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Mark glared at her, his hand still on his holster. "Stay out of this, rookie." Grace straightened her jacket and met Mark's glare. "This is harassment, Officer Anderson. I know my rights." Mark leaned closer to her, a smug smile on his face. "Out here, rights are what I say they are." Grace's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. Emily felt a mix of fear, anger, and a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just another traffic stop. It was something bigger. Mark's grip on Grace's arm tightened as he shoved her closer to the side of the car. Her bag slipped off her shoulder, scattering its contents onto the pavement: keys, a phone, and a notepad. Grace exhaled sharply but maintained her composure. "This is completely unnecessary," Grace said, her tone controlled. "I've complied with everything you've asked." Mark scoffed and crouched down, rummaging through her belongings without permission. His movements were deliberate, as if searching for something to justify his actions. "What's a woman like you doing in a car like this?" he muttered. Emily stepped closer, her hands clenched at her sides. "Mark, this isn't protocol. We don't have probable cause to search her things." Mark waved her off without looking up. "You've got a lot to learn, rookie. This is how you keep the streets clean." Grace's voice was firm. "Officer Anderson, you are violating my rights. You have no reason to search my property." Mark straightened up and held up one of her credit cards, as though it were damning evidence. "You don't get to lecture me, lady." You're in my town now." A crowd had gathered, their murmurs growing louder as several people began recording the scene. Grace noticed, but she didn't break eye contact with Mark. Emily's chest tightened as she saw Mark approach the car again. Her pulse quickened when she saw a small plastic bag between his fingers, one he hadn't taken from Grace's belongings. "Mark!" Emily hissed, barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned into the car and slipped the bag under the driver's seat, then turned to the crowd, holding up the bag as if it were a prize. "Well, well," Mark announced loudly, holding the bag of white powder for everyone to see. "Looks like we've got a little drug situation here." Grace's eyes widened, a mix of shock and fury flashing across her face. "That's not mine," she said firmly. "You just planted that in my car." Mark smirked, dripping with mockery. "Nice story, Miss Williams, but it's not going to hold up." The crowd's disbelief grew louder, their phones still recording. Emily felt nauseous. She had seen what Mark had done. He had planted the evidence. She knew it was wrong, but fear held her back. Grace turned her gaze to Emily, her eyes pleading. "You saw what he did. Please say something." Emily's throat tightened. Her voice was caught between her conscience and the fear of retaliation. She felt Mark's gaze burn into her, daring her to speak. "Stay quiet," his eyes seemed to warn, "or you'll regret it." But Emily couldn't shake the image of Mark planting the bag. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Integrity isn't easy, but it's what makes you a good person." "Mark," Emily said, her voice shaking but clear, "this isn't right." Mark turned on her, his face dark with fury. "You don't know what you're talking about. Keep your mouth shut." Grace stood tall, unflinching, her voice steady despite her anger. "You can't intimidate your way out of this. I know exactly what's happening here. And so does your partner." Mark took a step closer to Grace, his hand near his holster. "You think you're untouchable because you drive a nice car?" Emily shouted. "That's enough." The words came out louder than she meant, but she didn't back down. "You're crossing the line." The crowd had grown, and the weight of their gaze pressed down on the scene. Mark hesitated, glancing at the onlookers. He clenched his jaw but didn't speak. Grace took a deep breath, looking at Emily with gratitude. "Thank you for speaking up, but this isn't over." Emily nodded, a spark of determination igniting in her chest. For the first time, Emily found the courage to stand up for what was right. Mark sneered, turning his attention back to Grace, his anger palpable. The crowd remained, their phones capturing every moment. Leaning in close, Mark growled under his breath, "You think you're smarter than me? You think these people will help you?" Grace met his glare without hesitation, her voice calm but sharp. "I don't think it, Officer Anderson. I know I'm smarter than you, and you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." For a brief moment, Mark's confidence faltered, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. He reached for his handcuffs, stepping toward Grace. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance." Emily's breath hitched. This was the moment, where her career or her conscience would decide her path. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "If you don't stand up for what's right, you're just as guilty as those who do wrong." "No," Emily spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. She stepped between Mark and Grace, holding her ground. "This isn't right, and you know it." Mark's face turned red with fury. "Move out of the way, rookie. Don't make me report you for insubordination." Emily's voice shook, but she stood firm. "You planted that evidence. I saw you. I won't be part of this." The crowd gasped, murmurs of shock rippling through them. Grace, her expression softening, gave Emily a quiet nod of thanks. Mark's fury was almost tangible. He stepped closer to Emily, pointing a finger in her chest. "You're done. Do you hear me? I'll make sure you never wear that badge again." Emily squared her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of courage. If that's what it takes to do the right thing, so be it. Sensing the tension was at its peak, Grace spoke again, her voice commanding, "Officer Anderson, you might want to think carefully about your next move." Mark scoffed. "Oh yeah? And why is that? Grace reached into her jacket pocket, slowly pulling out her badge holder. She flipped it open, revealing her credentials. "My name is Captain Grace Williams," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm the new commanding officer for this precinct." For a moment, there was stunned silence. Mark's confidence shattered. That's not possible," he stammered. You can't be." Grace interrupted him. "You didn't even bother to ask before deciding I was a criminal, did you? But it shouldn't matter who I am. Every person deserves respect, not to be judged by the color of their skin or the car they drive." The crowd erupted into murmurs of disbelief. Some cheered, others shouted angrily at Mark. Emily felt her legs weaken, but she stood her ground. Grace's voice was calm as she turned to Emily, her expression softening. "Officer Carter, I know this isn't easy, but what you did took courage. Don't lose that." Emily nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't." Mark, still holding his badge, looked at Grace with a mixture of resentment and desperation. "You're making a mistake, Captain. People like you don't last long in this job." Grace stepped closer to him, her eyes locking onto his. "People like me? You mean people who believe in justice and equality? If that's a mistake, it's one I'll gladly make." The crowd erupted into applause, drowning out Mark's protests. Grace turned to the nearest bystander. "Thank you for recording this. Make sure it gets shared." Mark's face twisted in fury. "You're throwing me under the bus for optics. This is all a show." Grace didn't flinch. "No, Mark, this is accountability, something you clearly don't understand." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, signaling backup's arrival. Grace stood tall, her presence commanding, as Mark reluctantly handed over his badge and weapon, his bravado gone. Emily watched, a swirl of emotions in her chest, relief, guilt, and hope. Another patrol car arrived, 2 officers stepping out and eyeing the crowd. Grace waved them over, her voice firm. "Escort Mr. Anderson to the precinct. He's suspended pending a full investigation." Mark's face turned crimson. "You can't be serious. This is my precinct, my team." Grace didn't even glance at him as she replied, "Not anymore." The crowd cheered, some shouting support for Grace, others demanding justice for the countless lives Mark had wronged. Mark was led away, his shoulders slumped, his arrogance completely stripped away. Grace faced the crowd, her voice rising above the noise. "This isn't just about me," she said, her tone resolute. "It's about holding people like him accountable. It's about making sure no one is above the law, not even the ones sworn to uphold it." The crowd erupted in applause, shouts of agreement filling the air. Emily stood there, a lump in her throat, realizing the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just about Grace or Mark. It was about the system, and it was changing. It was about the community reclaiming its faith in those entrusted with their safety. As the situation began to settle, Grace walked over to Emily, her expression softening. "You did the right thing today," she said, her voice warm. "I know it wasn't easy." Emily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I was scared. I didn't know if I'd lose everything." Grace placed a hand on her shoulder, offering reassurance. "You didn't lose anything that matters. Integrity is what defines us, not the badge." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as a deep sense of pride filled her. Pride she hadn't felt since her early days in law enforcement. For the first time, she understood the true meaning of serving and protecting. A local news crew arrived, cameras already rolling. Grace inhaled deeply, knowing the spotlight was about to shine brightly on her. She turned toward the cameras, her voice steady but resolute. "What happened here today is a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to uphold it," she stated. "We still have a long road ahead, but change begins with moments like this." As the crew captured her words, Emily stepped aside, allowing Grace to take charge. She watched as the crowd began to disperse, leaving behind an atmosphere filled with hope and determination. For Emily, this was just the start of a new journey, one where she could finally honor the oath she had taken. For Grace, it was an opportunity to reshape a flawed system from within. And for the community, it was the beginning of a spark, one that could ignite a wider movement for justice. The sound of sirens faded as Mark's patrol car disappeared down the street. Grace and Emily stood together side by side, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold.